But let's ask ourselves, what does this have to do with end-time prophecy? Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let's take a look at a prophetic story from the book of Genesis. Several months ago, I was listening to Rico Cortez teach on the prophetic meaning of Joseph in Genesis 41, specifically Joseph and the dream of Pharaoh. And I found some interesting information by Rico that I never would have looked at if I hadn't been watching him. Let's take a look at this and see. This is Genesis 41, the Torah teaching Miketz, which actually means at the end. Get that, end times. And he was connecting Joseph's story to the second coming of Yeshuah and the end of days. So let's take a look at this of Pharaoh's dream. So remember the dream. We have, of course, Pharaoh stood on the edge of a river, and he dreamt of 7 fat cows, and then 7 thin cows came out of the river and they ate up the fat cows. Then we had 7 stalks of fat wheat that rose up, and then the 7 stalks of thin wheat or corn rose up and ate the fat corn. Pharaoh woke up, and Joseph interpreted the dream for him. So what does that mean for us prophetically? This is where Rico brought out a really interesting point. Look at this. He talked about the phrase, Pharaoh stood on the edge of a river. Now, Rabbi Yohanan said, when thou seest a generation overwhelmed by many troubles as by a river, await him, meaning Messiah. Interesting. So when you see a man standing on the edge of a river, you can look at that as a marker of the Messiah about to come. And I began to look a little bit more at this. Wait a minute. This happened in 2 years. The Bible starts out saying 2 years later. And in biblical meaning, 2 years could be 2,000 years, which again, we're talking about our time right now, the end of days. And I started to think about this. I went, wait a minute. There are 7 cows, 7 fat cows, 7 thin cows, 7 fat stalks of grain, 7 thin stalks of grain. It's 4 cycles of 7. And I thought, wait, what if there are 4 war cycles? And I thought, wow, look at that. Maybe God was using this prophetic story to warn of possibly 4 war cycles? I'm not sure, but I think it's interesting to take a look at. Now again, I'm not going to say this is doctrine. There are lots of different interpretations and multiple layers of meaning for the story of Joseph and Pharaoh's dream. But I would like to look at this as a possible alternative to maybe the end of days that we're looking at for war cycles. Let's just suppose, and let's take this a little bit further. Let's look at the war cycles if there's 4 war cycles. We have the beginning war cycle, and you see September 30th it started, of 2000. We had quite a bit happening. And then the next war cycle you see began 2007, ended 2014. Even more things happened. 2014 began, and then it ends in 2021. A whole lot's happening. Isn't this kind of increasing like birth pangs? We still have 1 full war cycle to go. We have the rest of this war cycle and a whole other war cycle to go. Now, I started looking at this a little bit, and I looked at the midpoint eclipse. So let's look at this midpoint eclipse. So we have the 4 war cycles ending in 2028. That's 28 years of the judgment of the nations. We're talking about the judgment of the nations. The midpoint eclipse on Nisan 1, which happened March 20th of 2015, was a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse signifies judgment on the nations. Now this solar eclipse occurred over the North Pole, which is the top of the world. This is the only time in history that this has ever happened. That actually looks very significant as well. And then I thought of something else. Wait a minute. What if I take that midpoint eclipse and superimpose that chart that we were looking at the beginning of the Lord's perfect sign? And this is what it looks like. We see an exactly symmetrical chart over 4 war cycles. The eclipses, the midpoint eclipse is almost, not quite in the middle, of 28 years of war cycles. So I'd like to propose to you, by looking at this, that the 4 blood moons are not warning of an event that's going to happen at the end of the blood moon, but an actual period of time. Let me say that again. The blood moon eclipses are not signals of an event. They're signals of a period of time. A time of what? Of harvest and the judgment of the nations. What would that look like? Okay, let's explain a little bit about harvest. For those of you that have been watching my teachings for a while, you understand that God deals with harvests. All of his feasts and festivals are all about harvest times. The end of days are all about the fall feasts or the fall harvest time, which is what I believe we're in. So let's look at harvest. In Jewish thought, cattle were considered to be sheep and goats. Now the cattle are going to be driven out of the wilderness of the nations during these war cycles, and we see that happening. Ezekiel 34:20 says, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself would judge between the fat sheep, cattle, and the lean sheep, cattle." One of my favorite teachers says there must be a hard and fast time period of purging to separate the sheep from the goats, the cattle, and the chaff from the wheat, the sheaves of corn. But this is also the time of the great triumph over evil by the servants and soldiers of Yahweh. So if we look at this time as a harvest time, we are seeing in the first two war cycles a division of sheep and goats, or cattle, if you will. Now we're getting into the third war cycle, as you can see by the chart. This is the beginning of the harvest of wheat, the harvest of the nations. Now I believe this harvest in this war cycle you see here, will increase in intensity. Both Jews and Christians will be affected by this. And you'll understand why if you've had a chance to look at my teaching on what is the fullness of the Gentiles. Because you understand in that Jews and Gentiles, it's Judah and Israel or Ephraim being harvested out of the nations. And finally, we'll have to look at how does harvest or judgment come? And let's look at a history of how harvest and judgment comes. What are who has Yah used when he needed to judge Israel? If we go back in history and look at the Old Testament, specifically the historical books of the Old Testament, you can see that God uses the same people over and over again for judgment or pressing. Now, when you think of judgment, I don't want you to think of punishment. Judgment is more of a harvest, right? For example, a tribulum, which is where we get the name tribulation, is a farm instrument that is raked over wheat to separate the grain from the chaff. It's pulled by cattle, usually or oxen. So they'll pull this tribulum over the wheat, over the harvest, to separate the good grain from the chaff or the straw, which is then either gathered up and burned or blown away by the wind. So you have to have a pressing or a tribulum in order to separate that out. But who does God use when he wants to use a judgment or a tribulum? Go back in history. Who does he use? The Persians. Persians in this day and age is Iran. He uses the Babylonians, present-day Iraq. He uses the Assyrians, present-day Syria. He uses Edom, or the Palestinians. And he also uses the Philistines, which also include a lot of the same people. He is using the same people today, including what's called ISIS. Now, if that is true, are there any symbolism within Islam that matches these symbols of cows and wheat or corn? Yes, there are. Look at this. In Islam, 14 cows equals war. What do we have in these first two war cycles? 7 fat cows, 7 thin cows. 14 cows equals war. And then as I was studying this, I discovered that ISIS had just minted new coins to use in their caliphate. And wouldn't you know, on the back of one of those coins, they include 7 stalks of corn or wheat. Isn't that amazing? So we do see the symbolism in Islam in these war cycles as well, or in these symbols of the cow and the wheat. So let's go back a little bit. We'll go back in history. We're going to look at the blood moons that have occurred just briefly to see if Islam has been involved with those. The first one you see here, Islam and the 8 blood moon triads. The first blood moon triad was the worst persecution of both Christians and Jews. Islam was not created at that time. They weren't really involved. The second blood moon, 795, 796, it was an Islamic invasion. 842 to 843, Islamic invasion. 860 to 861, Islamic invasion. 1493 to 1494, the Jews were severely persecuted at that time. Islam was not so involved in there. They were involved, but not to like an invasion. 1949 to 1950, what did we see? An Islamist attack when Israel became a nation and their defeat. 1967 and 1968, again, Islamic attack. And Israel won miraculously in 7 days, and we had their defeat. Now, in these present blood moon triads, what are we seeing? An Islamic caliphate that is actually growing. So we do see that these blood moons are dealing a lot with Islam as a method of judgment between Judah and Israel, or Ephraim, lost in the nations. What do these next 13 to 14 years hold? We still have the rest of this war cycle, if my theory is correct. Things aren't going to come to a culmination at 2014 at the Feast of Sukkot. I think it might just be the beginning. So we have we have still the rest of this blood moon cycle, and you can see we have a whole nother cycle in this chart, and until September 30th of 2028, when the end of those war cycles begin. We have to ask ourselves, what do these next 13 to 14 years hold? Well, we'll be teaching a little more about that in future teachings. I hope you enjoyed this teaching, and I hope maybe I could just bring across one thing to you, that these blood moons are not about an event that is going to happen in September, but they are warning us of a period of time of harvest and judgment, and we have to be prepared and know what to do. Thank you for joining me today. I hope to join you again next time in Coffee with My Friends.